The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his decoding machine in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor. It was May 26, 1942, and the cryptanalysts' bloodshot eyes strained to make sense of the intercepted Japanese naval communications. For weeks, he and his team had been breaking fragments of the enemy's JN-25 code, piecing together what appeared to be preparations for a massive operation. The target remained maddeningly elusive, coded only as AF. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood behind Rochefort, his weathered face grave with concern. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and American forces in the Pacific had been fighting a desperate defensive campaign ever since. The Japanese Empire's military machine seemed unstoppable, having conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and much of Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency. Now, intelligence suggested they were planning their next devastating blow. "What do you make of it, Commander?" Nimitz asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rochefort removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. "Admiral, I believe they're planning something big. The volume of traffic, the urgency in their communications. This isn't just another raid. This could be the decisive battle they've been building toward. The stakes could not have been higher." American naval power in the Pacific hung by a thread after Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet had lost 8 battleships in that surprise attack, and though some had been salvaged and repaired, the psychological wound remained deep. Aircraft carriers had become the new backbone of naval warfare, and America possessed precious few of them in the Pacific theater. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was finalizing his most ambitious plan yet. From his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, he surveyed charts of the Central Pacific with the confidence of a man who had never known naval defeat. His combined fleet represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled, with 4 massive aircraft carriers forming its deadly core. According to naval historian Gordon Pranga's seminal work, Miracle at Midway, Japanese confidence was at its absolute peak during this period. Yamamoto's strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences. By attacking the American base at Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii, he would force the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. The Americans would have no choice but to defend this crucial outpost, which served as an early warning station for Hawaii itself. When they emerged to fight, Yamamoto's superior force would crush them completely, leaving the Hawaiian Islands defenseless and forcing America to negotiate peace. The Japanese admiral had every reason for confidence. His carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had terrorized the Pacific for months, their experienced pilots having honed their skills in combat from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. These floating airfields carried the most advanced naval aircraft in the world, flown by aviators who had trained for years and proven themselves in battle after battle. But Yamamoto had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed American codebreakers could not penetrate Japanese naval communications deeply enough to discern his intentions. In the shadowy world beneath Pearl Harbor, however, Rochefort and his team were proving him catastrophically wrong. Every intercepted message brought them closer to understanding not just the target, but the timing and scale of the coming assault. As May drew to a close, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with terrifying clarity. The Americans were about to face their greatest test since the Revolution, outnumbered and outgunned by an enemy that had never known defeat at sea. The breakthrough came on May 27th, when Rochefort's team intercepted a message that would change the course of the war. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton burst into Admiral Nimitz's office, clutching a decoded intercept that finally revealed the Japanese target. Through an ingenious deception, having Midway broadcast a fake message about water shortage problems, American intelligence had confirmed that AF indeed referred to Midway Atoll. "Admiral," Layton announced breathlessly, "we know where they're going and we know when. June 4th at dawn, 4 carriers supported by battleships and cruisers. It's everything Yamamoto has." Nimitz absorbed this information with the calm that had made him one of America's most trusted naval commanders. The odds were staggering. The Japanese would outnumber American forces nearly 2-1 in every category that mattered. But for the first time since Pearl Harbor, America would have something the Japanese had never faced: advance warning of their intentions. The admiral immediately summoned his two most capable carrier commanders. Vice Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, the aggressive fighter who had been leading hit-and-run raids against Japanese positions, was hospitalized with a severe skin condition. In his place, Halsey recommended Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a quiet, methodical officer who had never commanded carriers in combat but possessed a brilliant tactical mind. Rear Admiral Frank "Jack" Fletcher would lead the overall force from his flagship Yorktown, despite the carrier having suffered significant damage during the recent Battle of the Coral Sea. Naval engineers at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock to repair her flight deck and patch her hull, accomplishing in 72 hours what should have taken 3 months. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison noted in his definitive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II that this rapid repair job represented one of the most remarkable feats of naval engineering in American history. As American preparations intensified, the Japanese fleet was already moving toward its destiny. From bases scattered across the western Pacific, Yamamoto's massive armada began converging on Midway. The striking force, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, departed from Japan on May 27th, their 4 carriers loaded with over 200 of the finest aircraft in the Imperial Navy. On the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veteran pilots conducted final inspections of their aircraft. Many of these men had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and every major Japanese naval operation since. They flew Mitsubishi Zero fighters that could outmaneuver any American aircraft, and Nakajima torpedo bombers that had proven devastatingly effective against enemy ships. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attacks on Pearl Harbor, prepared his crews with the confidence born of repeated victory. The Americans, he knew, were still reeling from months of defeats. Their pilots were inexperienced, their aircraft inferior, and their tactics predictable. This battle would be another triumph for the Emperor's Navy, but aboard the American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Pilots who had learned their craft in the harsh school of combat were briefing for what they knew might be their final mission. Many were barely out of their teens, having enlisted after Pearl Harbor with vengeance burning in their hearts. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, studied intelligence photos of Japanese carriers with the intensity of a man whose decisions would soon determine the fate of nations. These young Americans might lack the experience of their Japanese counterparts, but they possessed something equally valuable: the desperate courage of men fighting for their homeland's survival. By June 1st, both fleets were steaming toward their rendezvous with history. Neither commander fully understood what awaited them in the waters around a tiny atoll that most Americans had never heard of, but both knew that the outcome would determine whether the rising sun or the stars and stripes would dominate the Pacific for generations to come. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, the pre-dawn darkness over Midway Atoll shattered with the roar of aircraft engines. Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers had achieved complete tactical surprise, positioning themselves 200 miles northwest of the tiny American base under cover of night. From the flight decks of his 4 carriers, 108 Japanese aircraft rose into the gray morning sky, their mission to obliterate American defenses and prepare the way for invasion. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the first wave, his horizontal bombers and dive bombers escorted by deadly Zero fighters. As they approached Midway, the Japanese pilots could see the coral atoll spread before them like a target drawn on blue paper. The 2 small islands, Eastern and Sand, contained everything the Americans had managed to cram onto 6 square miles of reclaimed land: runways, fuel depots, barracks, and gun emplacements. The attack began at 6:20, and for 20 minutes, Midway disappeared beneath a storm of bombs and bullets. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel tanks exploded in towering pillars of black smoke, and defensive positions crumbled under the relentless assault. American Marines manning anti-aircraft guns fought back with desperate courage, their tracers reaching toward the diving Japanese planes like deadly fireworks. But unknown to Tomonaga and his pilots, their surprise attack had already failed in its most crucial objective. At 5:34 that morning, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed had spotted the approaching Japanese fleet and radioed the warning that changed everything. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. According to Walter Lord's comprehensive account, Incredible Victory, this single radio transmission represented the turning point that transformed certain American defeat into possible victory. Admiral Fletcher, monitoring radio traffic from Yorktown, immediately understood the significance of Reed's report. The Japanese had revealed their position while their aircraft were committed to attacking Midway, leaving their carriers temporarily vulnerable. He ordered Spruance to launch everything Enterprise and Hornet could put in the air, holding back only enough aircraft to defend his own task force. The American response was immediate but chaotic. 116 aircraft launched from the two carriers in a race against time, their pilots knowing that success depended on catching the Japanese carriers, while their decks were crowded with returning aircraft and bombs. But coordination broke down almost immediately as different squadrons became separated in the vast expanse of ocean, each group navigating by dead reckoning toward where they hoped to find the enemy. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the first critical decision of the battle. Tomonaga's radio message from over Midway was urgent. There is need for a second attack. The American base had been damaged but not destroyed, its runways still operational and its defenses still fighting. But Nagumo also had to consider another threat. His reconnaissance aircraft had reported American ships in the area, though their exact composition remained unclear. Should he prepare his reserve aircraft with torpedoes to attack enemy vessels, or with bombs for a second strike on Midway? The Japanese admiral chose what seemed the prudent course: rearm his reserve aircraft with bombs for another attack on the atoll. This decision would prove catastrophic, as it left his carriers crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance, just as American dive bombers began their deadly approach. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, was the first to find the Japanese fleet. Flying obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, he led his 15 aircraft in a suicidal attack against the heavily defended carriers. Japanese Zeros fell upon the slow, lumbering American planes like hawks among pigeons. One by one, the Devastators tumbled burning into the sea. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft were destroyed, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to watch the continuing battle from his life raft. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 seemed meaningless, but their attack had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, just as the real threat appeared high overhead. The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the instrument of Japanese, Idum. At 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward across the blue Pacific. The pilot of Enterprise's dive bombers had been searching for over an hour, his fuel running dangerously low, when he made the decision that would alter the course of World War II. Instead of turning back to his carrier, he followed the destroyer's wake, gambling that it would lead him to the main Japanese fleet. 4 minutes later, McCluskey's gamble paid off spectacularly. Spread out before him like toys on a blue carpet were 3 Japanese aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, fuel hoses snaking across the wooden planking, and ordnance scattered everywhere as crews rushed to prepare for another strike. "Attack immediately," McCluskey radioed to his 37 dive bombers. "Pick your targets and make them count." What followed were 5 minutes that military historians would later call the most decisive in naval warfare. At exactly 10:26, McCluskey's dive bombers rolled over and plunged toward their targets, their 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the heart of Japanese naval aviation. The first bomb struck Akagi amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among fueled and armed aircraft. The flagship that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack became an inferno within seconds. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, watched in horror as his command ship transformed into a floating crematorium. Gordon Pranga's detailed analysis in Miracle at Midway describes these moments as the 5 minutes that doomed the Japanese Empire's expansion in the Pacific. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers against Soryu. His aircraft had launched later than the others, but they arrived at precisely the right moment to join the devastating attack. Soryu, caught with her decks full of armed aircraft, exploded with such violence that she would sink within hours. Kaga, the third carrier, suffered an equally catastrophic fate. Bomb after bomb crashed into her flight deck, igniting aviation, fuel and ammunition in a chain reaction of destruction that could be seen for miles. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews trapped below decks or incinerated in the flames above. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto remained on Soryu's bridge as his ship died beneath him, choosing to go down with his vessel rather than abandon his crew. Across the fleet, similar scenes of courage and tragedy played out as the pride of the Japanese Navy burned. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been positioned slightly apart from the others and initially escaped the American attack. Her captain, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterattack with every aircraft he could muster. If he could cripple even one American carrier, the battle might still be salvaged. At noon, 18 Japanese dive bombers found Yorktown and pressed home their attack with the skill and determination that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. 3 bombs struck Fletcher's flagship, knocking out her boilers and leaving her dead in the water. For a brief moment, it seemed the Japanese might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But Yorktown's damage control teams worked miracles, restoring power and getting the carrier moving again within an hour. When a second Japanese attack arrived, this time with torpedo bombers from Hiryu, they found what appeared to be an undamaged American carrier and assumed they were attacking a different ship. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, and this time, the damage was mortal. The gallant carrier that had fought from the Coral Sea to Midway began listing heavily, forcing Admiral Fletcher to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Yet even as Yorktown began her death struggle, American dive bombers were racing toward Hiryu to complete the destruction of Nagumo's once mighty force. The sun reached its zenith over the Pacific, illuminating a seascape transformed. Where the morning had dawned with 4 powerful Japanese carriers dominating the ocean, now only smoke and debris remained of 3, while the 4th prepared to make its final stand. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey had already secured his place in history, but as afternoon shadows lengthened over the Pacific on June 4th, his war was far from over. Reports reached Enterprise that Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, was still operational and dangerous. At 4:30 in the afternoon, McCluskey once again led his dive bombers into the sky, this time accompanied by aircraft from both Enterprise and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu knew his situation was desperate. 3 of his fellow carriers lay burning or already beneath the waves, taking with them hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. His own ship represented the last hope. For salvaging something from what had begun as certain victory, he had already launched 2 strikes against the Americans, crippling Yorktown, but intelligence reports indicated at least 2 American carriers remained operational. The Japanese admiral faced an impossible choice. He could retreat, preserving his ship and remaining crew for future battles, or he could fight to the death in hopes of inflicting enough damage to make the American victory Pyrrhic. True to the samurai code that governed Japanese naval tradition, Yamaguchi chose to fight. Samuel Eliot Morrison's The 2 Ocean War notes that this decision, while tactically questionable, embodied the fighting spirit that had made the Japanese Navy so formidable throughout the early war period. At 5 o'clock, 24 American dive bombers found Hiryu steaming desperately northward, her flight deck spotted with the few aircraft she had managed to recover from earlier strikes. Unlike the morning attack that had caught 3 carriers with their defenses down, this assault faced prepared and desperate resistance. Japanese Zero fighters rose to meet the attackers, their pilots knowing they were fighting not just for their ship but for the honor of the Imperial Navy. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around Hiryu as her gunners threw up everything they had. But the American pilots, emboldened by their morning success and flying with the precision born of constant combat, pressed their attacks home with deadly accuracy. The first bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck forward of the island superstructure, blasting a massive hole in the wooden planking and starting fires in the hangar below. A second bomb penetrated to the engine room, while a third and fourth turned the carrier's forward section into a blazing inferno. Within minutes, the last of Nagumo's carriers was following her sisters into destruction. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his flagship die around him, made the same choice as Captain Yanagamoto of Soryu. Rather than abandon ship, he would remain aboard and share his vessel's fate. As evening approached, Hiryu's crew fought desperately to save their ship, but the fires had spread too far and burned too deep. By 10 o'clock that night, the carrier was a floating torch, her ammunition beginning to explode in spectacular displays of light against the darkness. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, faced the most difficult decision of his distinguished career. His carefully planned operation had become a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, were gone, along with many of their irreplaceable air crews. Some of his subordinates urged him to press forward with the surface engagement, using his powerful battleships to bombard Midway and force the Americans into a night action where Japanese superiority in that type of warfare might still win the day. But Yamamoto was too experienced a strategist to compound disaster with desperation. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, the architect of Pearl Harbor issued the order that acknowledged Japan's first major defeat. The Midway operation is canceled. All forces will withdraw. As dawn broke on June 5th, the Pacific battlefield told its own story, where the previous morning had seen the mightiest naval force in Japanese history, steaming confidently toward what seemed certain victory. Now only debris and oil slicks marked the graves of 4 aircraft carriers. Hiryu had finally succumbed to her wounds during the night, taking Admiral Yamaguchi and many of her crew to the bottom of the Pacific. The withdrawal of the Japanese fleet did not end the battle entirely. Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, was taken under tow as American salvage crews fought to save the gallant carrier. But on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 found the crippled ship and finished what the Hiryu's aircraft had begun, sending Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond to join the Japanese carriers on the ocean floor. The tally was staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison. 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and fewer than 400 casualties. The news of the disaster at Midway reached Tokyo like a physical blow to the heart of the Japanese Empire. Emperor Hirohito, receiving the report in his palace, maintained the stoic composure expected of a divine ruler. But those close to him noted the profound shock in his eyes. In one battle, Japan had lost not just 4 aircraft carriers, but the strategic initiative that had carried them from triumph to triumph since Pearl Harbor. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo immediately imposed strict censorship on all news of the defeat. Japanese citizens, accustomed to an unbroken string of victories, were told only that their forces had engaged the enemy at Midway and withdrawn after completing their mission. The families of the 3,000 men who had perished received letters stating their loved ones had died gloriously for the emperor, but no details of the catastrophe were revealed. But truth has a way of surfacing, even under the most repressive regimes. Within weeks, rumors began circulating through Tokyo's military circles about a great naval disaster in the Central Pacific. The sudden appearance of wounded naval personnel in Japanese hospitals, the mysterious disappearance of entire air squadrons, and the absence of victory parades all pointed to something far different from the official version of events. According to historian John Keegan's analysis in the Second World War, the Japanese government's decision to conceal the full extent of the Midway disaster prevented the nation from fully understanding how dramatically the war's trajectory had changed. Admiral Yamamoto, bearing the crushing weight of responsibility for the defeat, offered his resignation to the Naval General Staff. But Emperor Hirohito, recognizing that the architect of Pearl Harbor remained Japan's most capable naval strategist, refused to accept it. Instead, Yamamoto was ordered to develop new strategies for a war that had suddenly become defensive rather than offensive. The psychological impact of Midway extended far beyond the loss of ships and men. For 6 months, Japanese forces had seemed invincible. advancing across the Pacific with a momentum that appeared unstoppable. Now, for the first time, American forces had not merely survived a major engagement, but had won it decisively. The myth of Japanese invincibility lay shattered on the bottom of the Pacific alongside Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz surveyed the intelligence reports with quiet satisfaction. The victory at Midway had been so complete, so unexpected, that many of his own officers initially refused to believe the damage assessments. But as reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the destruction of the Japanese carrier force, the full magnitude of the triumph became clear. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, the codebreaker whose intelligence work had made the victory possible, found himself overwhelmed by congratulations from officers who had previously dismissed him as an eccentric academic. His basement operation, derided by some as a waste of resources, had provided the United States with its most crucial strategic advantage: knowledge of enemy intentions. The ripple effects of Midway spread across the Pacific theater like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Japanese forces, suddenly deprived of adequate air cover, found themselves unable to maintain their advanced positions. Plans for the invasion of Australia were quietly shelved, as were operations against Hawaii and the American West Coast. Perhaps, most importantly, American industrial capacity, fully mobilized by December 1941, began producing new aircraft carriers at a rate that Japan could never match. The Essex-class carriers rolling off American shipyards would soon restore and then exceed the naval aviation strength lost at Pearl Harbor, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace even a fraction of their Midway losses. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to follow a destroyer's wake had led to the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers, returned to Enterprise as a hero. But like many combat veterans, he found little satisfaction in personal glory. Too many good men had died, American and Japanese alike, for victory to feel like celebration. The Battle of Midway officially ended on June 7, 1942, when the last Japanese forces cleared the operational area. But its consequences would resonate throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond. Japan's opportunity to achieve decisive victory in the Pacific had passed forever, while America's industrial and demographic advantages would now have time to assert themselves. The years that followed, military historians would debate the tactical decisions, strategic implications, and turning points of those 4 days in June. But one fact remained undisputed. At Midway, the United States Navy had faced potential annihilation and instead delivered a blow from which the Japanese Empire would never recover. The rising sun, which had seemed destined to dominate the Pacific, had begun its long descent toward defeat.